In the early 1900s, Emmeline Pankhurst founded the Women's Social and Political Union as part of the campaign to give women the vote. The group's members, better known as suffragettes, used militant tactics, campaigning under the banner, "Deeds, not words." Two prominent suffragettes who fought for equal rights were doctors Flora Murray and Louisa Garrett Anderson.
Murray had acted as personal honorary physician to the militant organisation, so that when suffragettes were injured in scuffles, she would provide first aid. She treated hunger strikers after their release from prison. And she also, very bravely, carried out a vociferous campaign against the effects of forcible feeding and survived attempts by the Home Office to discredit her. Her friend and colleague, Dr. Louisa Garrett Anderson, was also a member of Mrs. Pankhurst's organisation, having been frustrated by the fact that the more moderate wing of the party was failing to get anywhere. She too, like Flora Murray, she spoke at meetings, she marched in processions, but in March 1912 she took the unusual step, unusual for a doctor, of throwing a brick through the window of a cabinet minister who had made an anti-suffrage speech, and for that she was sentenced to 6 weeks hard labour in Holloway. For a woman doctor, if they were seen to be active, it could actually threaten the rather precarious status of women in medicine.
At the outbreak of war in August 1914, suffragettes who'd been fighting for the right to vote suspended their militant campaign and devoted themselves to the war effort.
Murray and Anderson were quite clear that they could contribute to the medical services for the troops and should. They didn't go to the War Office and offer their services because they knew from their experiences in the suffrage movement that they'd be told to go home and knit socks or something. So they went to the French embassy.
Anderson and Murray quickly gathered a small group of women doctors, nurses and orderlies and set up a makeshift hospital at the Hotel Claridge in Paris. Their newly formed Women's Hospital Corps treated a constant stream of wounded troops over the next 6 months. By early 1915, the War Office started to set up new hospitals in England.
Murray and Anderson offered to go back and work in a hospital in England, and they were invited to meet the Director General of the Royal Army Medical Corps, Sir Alfred Keogh, who happened to be a supporter of women in medicine. And he, to their amazement, offered them the chance to run one of the new war hospitals. This was an extraordinary offer. Suddenly they were being acknowledged as capable of doing this. Murray and Anderson, of course, realised that it would give them the opportunity to show very publicly that professional women, medical women, could do the job as well as their male colleagues. So they seized the chance and rushed back to London.
The doctors were taken to a large Victorian workhouse on Endell Street, Covent Garden, which was undergoing rapid renovation work to transform it into the first British military hospital to be run by women.
Murray and Anderson were taken round the buildings that were to become the Endell Street Hospital in March 1915, and their guide was the colonel in charge of the renovations for the army. The colonel himself was absolutely appalled at the thought of women taking over his hospital, and he spent his time taking them round exclaiming, "Good God, women!" The officials in the War Office were convinced that the hospital wouldn't last more than 6 months. In the event, it lasted 4.5 years.
Murray and Anderson rapidly assembled a large staff of women, many of whom had been their colleagues in the suffragette movement before the war, and the Endell Street Military Hospital welcomed its first patients in May 1915.
There was a staff of about 180, 33 doctors, most of whom were just visiting consultants, but there were a number of junior doctors who lived in or close by. There were about 30 trained nurses. These were sisters. Most of the nursing was done by orderlies, nursing orderlies, and there were about 80 of those, mostly young girls. And then there were orderlies in the laundry, in the kitchen and so on. And then there were cooks, cleaners, quartermaster, transport officer, all women.
Two of the young women who volunteered to work at Endell Street were teenage sisters, Barbara and Nina Last.
My very beloved grandmother, who I still think of, although she died in 1973, was Nina Last. And her sister, her younger sister, was Barbara Last. Barbara was a born nurse, my great-aunt, and she signed up when the hospital opened. And she was only 17, and she was considered good by Dr. Flora Murray and Dr. Anderson, and they accepted her to be a nursing orderly. When my grandmother Nina arrived, she was given jobs that had been done by male orderlies, and that was really, I think, quite taxing. She was very tiny in stature, and she had to sort of take huge bins of sort of awful severed limbs and dirty dressings around the place and put them into incinerators and other places, and it was very, very hard physical work. When convoys came in, which was often about midnight, they'd get up and put clothes on over their nightdresses, put caps on over their pigtails, and go down into the courtyard and have to take out the men on the stretchers. And the stretchers' handles were huge, meant for men's hands, and my grandma's hands are very, very tiny. And so it was quite hard. I don't think she dusted a room, boiled an egg, or done any housework or anything like that before the war. And suddenly to be confronted with doing very heavy manual work must have been quite overwhelming, and I think she was overwhelmed. My grandmother wrote, "Forgetfulness of oneself was all." And they did. They just decided to forget themselves completely and devote themselves to helping the men. The military hospital, September the 8th, 1918. My darling mother. This place is an absolute hell. It is simply crammed with frightful cases, and convoys keep on coming in every night. I've had a tremendous week of it, and on Wednesday I had to go through over 500 sheets alone, not to speak of everything else. My idea of hell is always changing. It is now the dirty wash, which is unspeakably awful. Besides the smell and dirt, nearly all the bundles are full of vermin, and there is so much of it we can't forbear groaning aloud in agony. Nothing could prepare them for the carnage and the misery, the hell actually, what they met, people coming straight from the front. Dr. Louisa Anderson and Dr. Flora Murray told my grandmother that with the right kind of girl, they could do anything. The girls could do anything. They believed in the women.
I think because Endell Street was so near the main railway stations, it was inevitable that they received quite a high proportion of very severely injured patients. Well, when a convoy arrived, the bell sounded in the courtyard and everybody descended, the doctors and the stretcher bearers, everybody who was involved in reception of the convoy. And then these ambulances would come in. The women would lift the patients from the ambulances, which again was unheard of before. It wasn't thought suitable for women to be stretcher bearers. And then one of the senior doctors, Flora Murray or Louisa Garrett Anderson, would triage the patients and work out where they should go and what should happen to them. And then they'd be carried off by the orderlies to the wards or to the theatre. Murray and Anderson very much led by example. They worked themselves to the bone. Women joined them from all over, and most of them had had very little clinical experience. That was a fact for women doctors, unless they were lucky enough when they qualified to get a job at a woman-run hospital. It was almost impossible for them to practice after qualifying. Women doctors saw women and children. They didn't ever treat men, or virtually never treated men before the First World War.
In spring 1917, 28-year-old Dr. Vera Scantlebury travelled 10,000 miles from her home in Melbourne, Australia, for the chance to work with the women of Endell Street.
I am not at all keen on military surgery. I did some operations in the afternoon, 2 amputations, an infection of the pleuritic cavity, a very sick boy, and the other, a fracture of the arm in which the nerve was found divided and it needed suturing. I cannot bring before you a vivid picture of that beehive of an operating theatre, with its hot, stifling atmosphere and white-gowned and hooded women moving ceaselessly about, and the sweet, heavy, sickly fumes of the chloroform.
Having been met with initial hostility, the Suffragette Hospital soon became widely known and admired. In 1917, Murray and Anderson each received the CBE in recognition of their many achievements, which included the treatment of over 26,000 patients, 7,000 medical operations, and the first hospital-based clinical research papers to be published by women doctors in The Lancet.
I think their story is very inspiring, and I think as a woman doctor myself, I'm aware that they did a huge amount to overcome prejudice against women in medicine. The reason they had taken the hospital was to show that women could do the job as well as men, and therefore were equal citizens and had the right to the vote. They had, of course, shown very publicly what women could do. They had proved that they could run a hospital, that they could treat severely injured casualties, and that they could cope with complex medical and surgical problems. And they'd done all this without the world ending. The hospital took the motto of the suffragettes, which was deeds, not words, that your actions speak louder than your words. It's fair to say that despite the fact that the suffrage campaigns had stopped at the start of the war, campaigning was going on strongly in a British Army hospital.